George Washington. Thinking about George Washington is an opportunity to see how three important aspects of American liberty come together: history, government, and education. Sharing America's history, our founding principles, American Christian education are the reasons Pilgrim Institute exists. So I hope that something about George Washington inspires you to engage in the valuable work of preserving liberty. As we recall Washington's significant place in American history, it's helpful to think about how God directed his life from childhood to the end. What about Washington's education? Education is a tool that prepares us for our calling in life. And Washington's education is interesting. We can see evidence of it preserved for us in the Library of Congress because he kept notebooks, the school books of the time. They were copybooks in which students recorded the main points that would enable them to master their subjects, all written very neatly with ink and a quill pen. So hopefully you've seen some of Washington's beautiful handwriting. Out of necessity, they wrote their studies in personal notebooks. They often learned independently, pursuing their individual interests as well as preparing themselves for a future calling and purpose. Our founder, Mrs. Ruth Smith, has been advocating since 1973 for a teaching method which encourages reasoning, reflection, and recording the principles that equip students to master their subjects. Perhaps you know that in Washington's notebook, he recorded 110 rules of civility, rules that reflect the sort of conduct people of that day expected of others. Rule number 1 stated that your actions should show respect to the people around you. In other words, value them as individuals. That is one of the principles that we share. The last 3 rules are notable. They almost seem like 4 rules. When you speak of God or his attributes, let it be seriously and with reverence. Honor and obey your natural parents, although they be poor. Let your recreations be manful, not sinful. If you've been around us long, you've heard us talking about the Christian principle of self-government. And the last rule, labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. When you think of our founders, valuing individual liberty and self-government, conscience is a big part of that idea. Washington's school books contain not only the rules of civility, standard academic subjects he was learning, but a specific field of study he was pursuing on his own. When Washington's father, Augustine, died, George was 11 years old. Undoubtedly, that was a difficult loss for George, for the entire family. We know that it influenced his education by keeping him closer to home rather than going to England for a period of education as his father and brothers had done. His school books at the Library of Congress contain so many interesting subjects: geometry, decimals, trigonometry, measuring, geography, including geographical definitions. Defining words is another way we encourage students to research and reason, because investing personal effort to find information for ourselves is so important. A scholar describing Washington's interests said that he loved maps. There were other topics in his school books: calculating interest, even how to keep ink from molding or freezing. And although we don't know exactly when this happened, George discovered surveying tools which had belonged to his father. And with the help of those tools, he began cultivating what would become not only a lifelong interest, but it was his first profession. How would a boy of perhaps 13 or so learn the skill of surveying. If you're thinking he would find a book, you would be right. He was able to borrow from the Fairfax family a book called The Complete Surveyor, The Whole Art of Surveying of Land. That's actually just the beginning of the title. And if you know about old books, you won't be surprised. That book remained in Washington's library throughout his life. It is the oldest book in the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Washington put those surveying tools and the knowledge he was learning to work, surveying nearby land, including his brother's turnip field at Mount Vernon. We share just a bit of that story in our first Mighty Works of God history book, Self-Government. Imagine a 15-year-old surveying land, keeping records. By the age of 16, he was hired to assist on a surveying expedition for Fairfax family. And by the time he was 17, he was hired to be the surveyor of the newly formed Culpeper County. Washington held that position for 3 years before entering military service. Some of his surveys are preserved in the Library of Congress. So it's not surprising that his firsthand knowledge of the land was useful during his service in the British military, or that it prepared him to serve as commander-in-chief of the American Army. One step at a time, one experience at a time, Washington learned what would be necessary to lead our nation militarily through the Revolutionary War, then as a leader presiding over our Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, 1787, and finally serving our nation as our first president from 1789 to 1797, George Washington.